I need to talk to you again about Tommy Robinson, both because a lot has changed in his case, and also because he's become something of a symbol of freedom throughout the Western world. For those who don't know, Tommy Robinson is a British political prisoner who was arrested, sentenced, and imprisoned on the same day for reporting about Muslim child rape gangs. He was recently moved from the relatively safe, as prisons go, prison in Hull to a notoriously unsafe prison in Onley. Onley prison has a 30% Muslim population. So 1 in 3 inmates in Onley prison is Muslim. That's a big deal because Tommy Robinson has had countless different threats from Muslims because of what he talks about. He also has a fatwa out against him, instructing Muslims to actually kill him. So this is actually the most unsafe prison in the Midlands, which is like the entire region. I don't think it's a coincidence he was sent there. Because these aren't like regular Muslims you'd find on the street either, where you get a mixture of good and bad. Because we know that the British police have a policy of not arresting and imprisoning Muslims. We know that from these actual rape gang cases in places like Rotherham and in Telford. They didn't want to upset public relations or community relations, so they didn't prosecute. So the people that he's in there with are the worst of the worst. They're the people, the Muslims that they couldn't ignore. Onley was deemed unsafe in December of 2016 because of massive rates of violence. And that's not even unsafe for Tommy, that's unsafe just for a regular prisoner. It's so unsafe that he's recently been placed in solitary confinement for his own safety. That means that for 23.5 hours out of every day, Tommy is in essentially a concrete box, and then for 30 minutes of each day, he's outside but inside like a fenced-in cage for 30 minutes. He's been treated like the worst of the worst. He's been treated, ironically, like a terrorist. When he could have just been left in the prison in Hull, not that I think he should be in prison at all, but if he was there, he'd have normal interactions. He could be out on the wing and talking to normal people. Instead, he's the one that's being punished because other people are a threat to him. I think one of the reasons that Tommy is being so targeted by the elites in Britain is because not only does he talk about Islam and Muslims, but because he talks about pedophilia. There is a problem in Britain of pedophilia in the upper levels, the elite classes, whatever you want to call them. It's a lot like Hollywood in the United States, that kind of level of debauchery. And you know how here in Hollywood they all hate Trump? Well, one of the reasons for that is because Trump is attacking pedophiles. He has these massive roundup operations. In fact, the Department of Justice recently released a report that wasn't even reported by the mainstream news, where they said that about 2,300 pedophiles had been brought in and arrested in this big operation. That's why the people in Hollywood are one of the reasons why they hate Trump so much. Well, similarly, over there in the UK, these elites, they hate Tommy so much because he talks about pedophilia. Sure, right now he's talking about Muslim pedophilia, but what's to say that, tomorrow or a month from now or a year from now, he's not going to be talking about them? If you removed all the pedophiles from Hollywood, I don't think there'd be anything left. And it's kind of that same way with the elites in the UK. I've heard the argument justifying Tommy's arrest and imprisonment, saying that he broke the law and thus he deserves to be imprisoned, he deserves his sentence. Before we accept that narrative, we have to look at what exactly did Tommy do? What law did he supposedly break? Well, the only law that he's accused of breaking is contempt of court for reporting on Muslim child rape gangs. For speech, for being a reporter. When speech is a crime, there is a moral duty to break the law, a moral imperative, if you will. I mean, you can't have just all reporters decide, okay, we're not going to report anymore because we're afraid of the law. I mean, that's just abhorrent. Nobody would want to live in that kind of a society. Tommy did what any decent person would do. The argument in defense of this law is that if the media were to report on cases like this, high-profile cases, then it would in some way impact the jury negatively, and whoever was being charged would not have a fair trial. I think it's ludicrous, but let's just accept that as the narrative. If that was the case, then why wouldn't you do what is done here in the US all the time? There are plenty of high-profile cases. Bill Cosby was a recent one. It was all over the press all the time. But what you do is, you take the jury, the 12 people, or maybe a few extras, and you put them up in a hotel, and you cut off access to the news for those people, and only those people. You don't cut off the news to everybody, and at the same time cut off the freedom of speech to the reporters. That's obscene. It's crazy. Of course, it's also possible that's not the real reason that the law is in place, or why it's being enforced in this case. I think it's very likely that the real reason is they don't want the jury to know all of the information. See, if a jury had access to all of the different opinions and information, then they'd be more likely to give a harsher sentence, to hammer down a verdict. Whereas if they're only given snippets that the court allows them to hear, then they might be more lenient. It's, in a sense, a way of preventing a truly fair and honest judgment. It's to encourage lax judgments, in other words. Now, there is a concept in American society of natural rights, sometimes referred to as natural law. This is something that I never heard about in the 16 years that I spent in England. And I think it's a necessary change in outlook for the entire British population. If the Brits are to get their country back, to try to get control of their own government, their own country, I think they have to embrace this concept. If you believe in natural rights, then you believe that rights do not come from government. That people are inherently born with certain rights, such as the right to speak, the right to express one's own mind, the right to express an opinion, or the right to defend yourself from an attacker. These rights don't come from government. Government can only actually infringe upon these rights. They can prevent you from speaking, but they can't give you that right. That's inherent. The United States Declaration of Independence, which was independence from England, interestingly enough, it states that these rights are unalienable rights endowed by our Creator. By Creator, obviously, they meant God. And I know that England is a very secular, atheistic society at this point. But I think you have to have the belief that there is something greater than government. If you don't, then you risk, I think it's inevitable, that you fall into like a communistic state where government becomes God. And that's incredibly dangerous. In fact, those are the most totalitarian governments ever. Right? Before I go on, let me say that a right is not the same as a need. In politics, especially leftist politics, you hear the two terms kind of used interchangeably. You'll hear the right to healthcare a lot. But it's not really possible to have a right to healthcare. You have a need for healthcare. I might need healthcare. But that doesn't mean that I can force somebody else to help me. I don't have a right to his unpaid labor. Right? So that's right versus need. There's also a right is not a privilege. A privilege is something that the government can give you and the government can take away, unlike a right, which the government doesn't give you. Best example of a privilege is probably a driver's license. You're not born with the right to drive on the roads, but you have to learn all the different rules of the roads and then follow them, and if you don't follow them, you end up losing that privilege. Alright, we can't get these confused, because if we do, well, it changes the entire argument, the way we see things. I think one of the reasons, or perhaps the main reason, why this concept of natural rights is not discussed in England is because you can't believe that man has an inherent right and also believe in the so-called divine right of kings. The divine right of kings was the justification used to promote a monarchy. It was said in times past that the reason a monarchy can exist is because God has chosen certain people, certain families, and placed them in that position. They belong there. They have a right to rule over other people. That's the divine right. And while it's not spoken about now, that's how they got there. That's incompatible with saying that everybody has inherent rights. You know, the right to speak and express an opinion. You can't believe that and at the same time believe that one family has a right to trot on another. I know that people often mention that the monarchy doesn't have much influence over British politics anymore. And that's sort of true. It's certainly true that the Queen doesn't have as much influence as she may have had a few hundred years ago, sure. But there is an aristocracy in England that is still incredibly powerful. And that kind of is an extension of this whole monarchy system. Americans will probably be shocked to hear this. But you know how here in the US we have a House of Representatives and a Senate? Together, they make up Congress. Over in England, they have a House of Commons, for the commoners, and a House of Lords. The House of Lords is completely unelected. And again, both houses need to come together and agree before a law is passed. Half of government is unelected, appointed based upon family line or the corrupt friendships. That's abhorrent. And I will say that until you have a government that fears and works for the people, you will never be free. You can't be free. And these lordships, these people in the House of Lords, they're not going to fear or work for the people if they're not elected by them. Or more importantly, if they can't be unelected by them. They can't be replaced by the people. And in this sense, Britain needs a revolution. It needs an entire change of the way that it sees its government and the way the people see their rights. In the early part of the founding of America, one of the more influential people was Thomas Paine, and he wrote about this concept of monarchy. I'm going to paraphrase here, but he expressed that no man would ever say to another, to a king or to be king, I will forever serve you. And not only that, but my children, from here until forever, will forever serve your children and your grandchildren. Nobody will ever do that voluntarily. The monarchy, if you go far enough back, it was a might makes right sort of situation. They were the bullies, essentially. And there's no reason for government to work that way anymore. I mean, you might think it's cute to have these kind of figureheads after all this time. And sure, okay, but nobody should be in charge of people like that. And irreplaceable. Alright, please pass this video around. Because this Tommy Robinson story, I don't think it would have ever gotten out without people like you. Without the internet, without small media houses. The mainstream media only covered it when they had no choice, when it just made them look bad not to. So, if regular people let the momentum die on the Tommy Robinson issue, the media will most certainly let it die, because they want it to. So don't underestimate your own potential in passing this around. The story is growing from word of mouth, which is pretty incredible considering how much support there has been and how much momentum there still is. So don't let it fizzle out. So share this video and like it to make sure that it gets spread around maximally. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Health-wise.